The courthouse doors swung open that humid September morning, and Emily Whitmore walked through them with a smile that made every witness in the room feel a chill despite the oppressive Louisiana heat. The trial of Emily Whitmore would become one of the most disturbing legal proceedings in American history, not because of graphic violence displayed in open court, but because of the calculated coldness radiating from a girl barely 16 years old. In an era when childhood was considered a time of innocence and moral formation, Emily represented something the legal system of the 19th century had no framework to understand. A young mind capable of extraordinary cruelty, manipulation, and premeditation. New Orleans in the early years of the decade was a city of contradictions. The French Quarter bustled with commerce and culture, its narrow streets echoing with a mixture of French, Spanish, English, and Creole voices. Gas lamps were beginning to replace oil lanterns on main thoroughfares, and the city prided itself on its cosmopolitan character. Yet beneath this veneer of sophistication lay a rigid social hierarchy, a brutal system of enslavement, and a legal apparatus ill-equipped to handle the complexities of juvenile crime. Before continuing, check, right now, if already, this inscribed on the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see if there's someone from my city here. The Whitmore family occupied a respectable position in this society. Jonathan Whitmore, Emily's father, ran a successful shipping business along the Mississippi River docks. His warehouses stored cotton, sugar, and tobacco, destined for markets up north and across the Atlantic. The family lived in a 3-story townhouse on Royal Street, its wrought iron balconies adorned with ferns, and its interior decorated with furniture imported from France. To all outward appearances, they embodied the prosperity and refinement that New Orleans merchant class aspired to achieve. Catherine Whitmore, Emily's mother, was known for her charitable work with the Ladies' Benevolent Society and her elegant dinner parties. She dressed in the latest fashions from Paris and carried herself with the grace expected of a woman of her station. The Whitmores attended services every Sunday at the Presbyterian Church on Lafayette Square, where they occupied a prominent pew near the front. Emily was their only surviving child. 2 brothers had died in infancy, victims of yellow fever that swept through the city with terrifying regularity. Perhaps this made her parents more indulgent, more willing to overlook the small signs that something was profoundly wrong with their daughter. Or perhaps, as some would later suggest, they simply didn't want to see what was plainly visible to others. Emily's childhood, as reconstructed from testimonies and journals, revealed a pattern that would only become clear in retrospect. As a young girl of 7 or 8, she demonstrated unusual intelligence and an unsettling ability to read people's emotions and manipulate them to her advantage. Her governess, Miss Adelaide Thompson, would later testify that Emily seemed to understand instinctively how to play adults against each other. The household staff told stories that painted a darker picture. Marie Duchamp, the cook who had worked for the Whitmores since Emily was an infant, recalled finding dead birds in Emily's room, arranged in peculiar patterns. When confronted, Emily would claim she had found them already deceased and was trying to give them a proper burial. Her explanation was delivered with such apparent sincerity that Marie felt guilty for suspecting the child of wrongdoing. Thomas, the stable hand, reported that horses became nervous in Emily's presence. Once, a particularly spirited mare that had always been gentle kicked violently when Emily approached her stall. Thomas noticed scratches on the horse's flank afterward, thin and deliberate as if made with a nail or sharp stick. When he mentioned this to Mr. Whitmore, he was told not to spread malicious gossip about the family's daughter. Emily attended the Lafayette Academy for Young Ladies, where she excelled academically. Her French was flawless, her penmanship elegant, and her knowledge of literature, history, and mathematics exceeded that of girls several years her senior. Her teachers praised her dedication and her apparent desire to learn. What they failed to notice or chose to ignore was the way other students seemed to fear her. Margaret Sullivan, who had been Emily's classmate, would later provide testimony that shed light on this dynamic. She described how Emily had befriended her initially, showering her with attention and small gifts. But this friendship came with demands. Emily wanted to know everything about Margaret's family, her father's business dealings, her mother's social connections. When Margaret tried to distance herself, strange things began to happen. Margaret's favorite doll disappeared from her room at home. A week later, it was found in a cistern behind the school, dismembered and burned. Margaret's pet canary escaped from its cage and was found dead in the garden, though the cage door had been securely latched. Anonymous notes began appearing in Margaret's desk at school, containing details about her family that no outsider should have known. The headmistress, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, received complaints from several parents about Emily's behavior, but each incident, examined individually, seemed ambiguous. There was never direct proof that Emily was responsible for the disturbing events that seemed to follow her. She maintained an appearance of perfect propriety, always courteous, always respectful, always with a reasonable explanation. When Margaret's father, a prominent cotton broker, suffered a mysterious fire at his warehouse, losing a substantial portion of his inventory, Margaret's family abruptly withdrew her from the academy and sent her to live with relatives in Virginia. Before she left, she confided to one of the housemaids that she believed Emily had somehow caused the fire, though she had no evidence to support this claim. The pattern repeated with other girls. Emily would select a target, befriend them, extract information, and then turn on them in subtle but devastating ways. A stolen love letter would find its way to disapproving parents. A false rumor would spread through the social circles, destroying a family's reputation. A business opportunity would mysteriously fall through after confidential information became public. By the time Emily was 14, she had created an atmosphere of fear at the academy. Girls were careful not to cross her, not to refuse her requests, not to attract her negative attention. And yet, to the adults who ran the institution, Emily Whitmore remained a model student, poised and accomplished. Her parents remained willfully blind to the whispers and concerns. Jonathan Whitmore dismissed any criticism of his daughter as jealousy from families of lesser standing. Catherine Whitmore believed that Emily's intelligence and strong personality simply intimidated weaker girls who couldn't match her achievements. They saw what they wanted to see: a brilliant daughter who would make an advantageous match and bring further honor to the family name. In the spring, when Emily turned 15, a new teacher arrived at the academy. Miss Sarah Crawford was young, only 23, fresh from Boston with modern ideas about education and child development. She had read the latest theories about moral education and believed that young people could be guided toward virtue through proper instruction and example. Miss Crawford took a particular interest in Emily, seeing in her a pupil of exceptional potential. She spent extra time with the girl, lending her books, discussing philosophy and literature, encouraging her intellectual development. For several months, this relationship seemed positive. Emily appeared to blossom under Miss Crawford's mentorship, becoming more engaged in class discussions and even showing kindness to other students. But Miss Crawford made a critical error. She began to notice inconsistencies in Emily's behavior, moments when the mask would slip. She saw how Emily's eyes would light up when discussing historical accounts of betrayal and cruelty. She noticed how Emily would steer conversations toward topics of manipulation and power. Most disturbing was a composition Emily had written for an assignment on classical literature, in which she had praised the cunning of Medea with an enthusiasm that seemed to go beyond academic interest. When Miss Crawford gently tried to redirect Emily's interests toward more positive subjects, the girl's demeanor changed. The warmth and engagement vanished, replaced by a cold politeness. Within a week, Miss Crawford began experiencing problems. Her personal letters went missing from her room. False accusations about improper conduct with male faculty began to circulate. A valuable brooch that had belonged to her mother disappeared, only to be found in Miss Crawford's desk drawer at the academy, though she had kept it locked at her boarding house. The headmistress, already weary of the troubles that seemed to follow Emily, nonetheless felt compelled to investigate. The evidence against Miss Crawford appeared damning. The brooch had belonged to one of the students and had been reported stolen. Found in Miss Crawford's possession, it suggested theft. Combined with the whispers about improper behavior, it was enough to destroy her reputation. Miss Crawford was dismissed from the academy in disgrace. Unable to find another teaching position and facing social ostracism, she left New Orleans and returned to Boston, her dreams of an independent career in ruins. Before she departed, she wrote a detailed letter to the headmistress, explaining her suspicions about Emily and warning that the girl was dangerous. The letter was filed away and forgotten. Emily, meanwhile, continued her studies without apparent concern. If anything, she seemed more confident, more assured of her ability to escape consequences. She was now 16, approaching the age when young ladies of her class would be introduced to society and begin the process of finding suitable husbands. But Emily Whitmore had no intention of following the conventional path laid out for young women of her era. She had discovered something far more intoxicating than the prospect of marriage and domestic life: the power to destroy people's lives while maintaining an appearance of innocence. And she was about to apply this power in ways that would shock even a city as accustomed to violence and injustice as New Orleans. The spring social season brought a new family into the Whitmores' social circle: the Beaumonts, recently arrived from Charleston. Philip Beaumont had invested heavily in railroad ventures and came to New Orleans to expand his business interests. His wife, Isabella, was known for her refined taste and her connections to old Charleston families. Their son James was 22, educated at the College of Charleston, and considered an excellent prospect for marriage. Catherine Whitmore saw an opportunity. The Beaumonts were exactly the kind of family alliance she had hoped for Emily. James was handsome, well-educated, and would inherit a considerable fortune. More importantly, his family's social standing would elevate the Whitmores' position in both New Orleans and Charleston society. The families were introduced at a reception hosted by the mayor, and Catherine maneuvered to ensure that Emily and James were seated together at dinner. Emily, dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had commissioned from the city's finest dressmaker, played her part perfectly. She was charming but modest, intelligent but deferential, engaging but proper. James was captivated. Over the following weeks, the courtship proceeded according to the strict protocols of the era. James called at the Whitmore house, always properly chaperoned. They attended concerts and theater performances together, sat in adjacent pews at church, and took carefully supervised walks in the public gardens. To all observers, they seemed an ideal match. But Emily had no real interest in James Beaumont. He was a means to an end, and that end was far more calculated than anyone suspected. Through seemingly innocent conversations, Emily learned everything she could about the Beaumont family's business affairs, their social connections, their secrets, and their vulnerabilities. James, completely enchanted, shared far more than he should have. He told Emily about his father's investments, about deals that were pending, about competitors and rivals. He confided family secrets, including the fact that his mother's family fortune had been partially lost in some unfortunate speculation years earlier, something they preferred to keep quiet. He even mentioned tensions between his father and a business partner named Charles Devereux, who felt cheated in their railroad venture. Emily absorbed every detail with apparent sympathy and interest. She encouraged James to talk about himself, making him feel understood and appreciated. She was creating a comprehensive map of the Beaumont family's world, identifying pressure points and weaknesses. Meanwhile, she had not abandoned her other pursuits. Through the household staff, Emily had learned about a young woman named Claire Merchant, who worked as a seamstress in a shop on Chartres Street. Claire had the misfortune of being beautiful and talented, and she had recently attracted the attention of several young men from prominent families. One of them was David Morrison, the son of a judge who had business connections with Jonathan Whitmore. Emily arranged to have several dresses made at the shop where Claire worked, ostensibly because she had heard of the seamstress's skill. During the fittings, Emily engaged Claire in conversation, drawing out information about her circumstances. Claire was an orphan, living with an aunt, struggling to save money for her future. She dreamed of opening her own dress shop one day, of achieving independence and security. Emily presented herself as a potential benefactor. She praised Claire's work extravagantly and hinted that she might help the young woman establish her own business. She invited Claire to deliver some completed items to the Whitmore house, knowing that David Morrison was scheduled to call that same afternoon. The encounter was carefully orchestrated. Emily ensured that David saw Claire in a context that appeared compromising. She then spread subtle suggestions through the social network, a word here, a knowing look there, that David had been meeting secretly with a woman of questionable character. In the rigid social codes of the era, such an association could ruin a young man's prospects. When Claire attempted to deny any improper relationship, she found herself confronting a wall of skepticism. Who would believe a seamstress over the testimony of respectable society members? David, faced with scandal, was forced by his family to deny knowing Claire beyond a casual encounter. The damage to both their reputations achieved Emily's goal. David Morrison withdrew from social circulation, and Claire lost several important clients, including some who had been influenced by Emily's veiled insinuations. The cruelty of this maneuver was its precision. Emily had destroyed two people's prospects without any action that could be traced directly to her. She had simply set circumstances in motion and allowed social prejudices to do the work. But Emily's most ambitious scheme was still developing. She had continued to cultivate her relationship with James Beaumont while simultaneously gathering information about Charles Devereux, the disgruntled business partner. Through careful manipulation of conversations at social gatherings, she learned that Devereux felt he had been cheated out of his fair share in a railroad venture. He believed Philip Beaumont had used insider information to secure better terms, leaving Devereux with minimal profit. Emily began a correspondence with Devereux, using an intermediary to maintain her anonymity. The letters contained detailed information about Beaumont family finances, information that Emily had obtained through James's careless confidences. The letters suggested that Philip Beaumont was planning to expand his railroad investments in a way that would further marginalize Devereux's interests. At the same time, Emily fed James selected pieces of information designed to make him suspicious of Devereux's intentions. She mentioned, as if in passing, that she had heard rumors of Devereux making threats against the Beaumont family. She suggested that Devereux might be spreading false information to damage their reputation. The situation escalated when Devereux confronted Philip Beaumont at a business meeting, making accusations based on the information from the anonymous letters. The confrontation was heated and public, damaging both men's reputations. Philip Beaumont suspected Devereux of trying to sabotage his business ventures, while Devereux was convinced that Beaumont was conspiring to force him out entirely. As tensions between the two men increased, Emily played the role of concerned confidant to James. She expressed worry about the conflict, suggested that it might be dangerous, and encouraged James to confide in her about his family's troubles. Each piece of information she gathered was used to further inflame the situation. The situation reached a crisis point in early June. Charles Devereux, driven to desperation by what he believed was a systematic campaign to destroy him, made a reckless decision. He attempted to intercept a shipment of investment documents being transported to Philip Beaumont, hoping to find evidence of the fraud he was convinced had been committed against him. The attempted theft was discovered, and Devereux was arrested. The scandal was enormous. A man of previously good reputation, caught in an act of criminal desperation, claiming persecution but unable to prove it. The anonymous letters that had inflamed his paranoia could not be traced. The information they contained, while accurate, could have come from many sources. Philip Beaumont's reputation emerged largely intact, though the affair had cost him business relationships and social standing. James was humiliated by the public nature of the conflict and the revelation that his family's private business had somehow become public knowledge. The Beaumont family's stay in New Orleans, which had begun with such promise, was now tainted by scandal. It was at this point that Emily made her move. She expressed to James her concern that their association might be damaging to him, given the circumstances. She suggested with apparent reluctance that perhaps they should slow their courtship until the scandal had died down. She played the role of the selfless young woman willing to sacrifice her own happiness for his reputation. James, already emotionally vulnerable, was devastated. He begged Emily not to withdraw. He proposed marriage, convinced that she was the only person who truly understood and supported him during this difficult time. Emily accepted, but with conditions. She wanted a quick, quiet wedding, she said, to avoid drawing more attention to the Beaumont family troubles. The families agreed, seeing the marriage as a way to salvage something positive from the chaos. Plans were made for a ceremony in late summer, with a minimal guest list. Catherine Whitmore was disappointed by the lack of social spectacle, but consoled herself with the advantageous connection the marriage would bring. What no one realized was that Emily had orchestrated the entire sequence of events. From the initial gathering of information through James's confidences, to the anonymous letters that had driven Devereaux to desperation, to the final manipulation of James's emotions, all of it had been planned with meticulous calculation. And this was merely a prelude to what would come next, because Emily Whitmore had no intention of actually marrying James Beaumont. She had a very different plan in mind, one that would reveal the true extent of her capacity for cruelty and manipulation. The summer heat settled over New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. In the warehouses along the docks, workers labored through the oppressive humidity. In the grand houses of the Garden District, families retreated to shuttered rooms, seeking relief from the sun. And in the Whitmore house on Royal Street, Emily prepared for the next phase of her carefully constructed scheme. She had spent months building toward this moment, gathering information, cultivating relationships, and creating a web of circumstances that would allow her to execute a plan of breathtaking callousness. The wedding was scheduled for early September, just before the weather would begin to cool. But Emily had no intention of becoming Mrs. James Beaumont. Instead, she had been conducting a parallel courtship, one that her parents and the Beaumonts knew nothing about. His name was Robert Ashford, and he was everything James Beaumont was not: poor, ambitious, and willing to disregard social conventions in pursuit of advancement. Emily had first noticed Robert at the docks, where he worked as a clerk in one of the shipping offices. He was intelligent, well-spoken despite his limited education, and possessed of a burning resentment toward the wealthy families whose business he facilitated, but whose society he could never enter. Emily recognized in him a tool she could use. She had arranged seemingly chance encounters, gradually drawing him into conversation, flattering his intelligence and making him feel seen and valued in a way that his actual social position never allowed. Robert had fallen completely under her spell, convinced that she was a kindred spirit, trapped by the constraints of her family's expectations. Emily had painted herself as a victim to Robert, a sensitive soul forced into an unwanted marriage with the insufferable James Beaumont. She had shared carefully selected details of her life, creating a narrative of emotional abuse and parental control that would justify the drastic action she was about to propose. The plan was simple in its audacity. 1 week before the scheduled wedding, Emily would disappear from her family's house in the middle of the night and flee with Robert. They would travel upriver to St. Louis, where Robert had a cousin who could help them establish new identities. Emily had convinced Robert that once they were safely away, her family would eventually accept the situation, especially if they learned she was with child. What Robert didn't know was that Emily had been systematically stealing money and valuables from her own family's house for months, accumulating a substantial sum. She had also been forging documents that would allow her to access money from James Beaumont's accounts, using information he had shared with her about his banking arrangements. But the most devastating part of her plan was what she intended to do once she reached St. Louis. Emily had already arranged, through coded correspondence, to sell the stolen valuables and transfer the money to an account under a false name. She then planned to disappear again, leaving Robert to face the consequences alone. Robert would be found, arrested for kidnapping and theft, and likely hanged. Emily, meanwhile, would have vanished with enough money to start a new life somewhere else, perhaps even in Europe. She would have destroyed the Beaumont family's reputation, humiliated her parents, devastated James, and sent an innocent man to his death, all while escaping any personal consequences. It was a plan of extraordinary complexity and cruelty, one that required careful timing and nerve, and Emily was absolutely confident she could execute it. She had spent her entire life observing how people's assumptions and prejudices could be manipulated. She understood that Robert would be the perfect scapegoat, a poor man of no social standing who had dared to compromise a wealthy family's daughter. As the day of the planned elopement approached, Emily maintained her performance flawlessly. She attended wedding preparations with apparent enthusiasm, discussed honeymoon plans with James, and showed appropriate filial affection to her parents. No one suspected that behind her composed exterior, she was counting down the hours until she would set her plan in motion. On the night of August 28th, Emily retired to her room at the usual hour. She had packed a small bag with essentials hidden beneath her bed. She had written letters to her parents and to James, letters designed to mislead them about her intentions and her destination. She had memorized Robert's instructions for where to meet him and how to reach the boat that would take them upriver. Everything was ready. The moon was obscured by clouds, providing the darkness she needed. The household was asleep, the servants in their quarters, her parents in their room at the far end of the house. Emily, dressed in traveling clothes, retrieved her hidden bag and prepared to climb down from her second-floor balcony using a rope she had secured days earlier. But as she opened her window, she heard a sound that made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Someone was awake, moving through the house in the middle of the night. Emily's mind raced. Had someone discovered her plan? Was this merely a coincidence? The footsteps paused outside her door. Emily held her breath, her hand on the window frame. Then she heard a knock, soft but distinct. The door opened slowly and Emily's mother stood in the doorway holding a candle. Catherine Whitmore's face was pale, her expression a mixture of sorrow and something else. Something Emily had never seen in her mother's eyes before. It was disappointment mingled with a kind of grim resolution. "Emily," her mother said quietly, "I think we need to talk." For perhaps the first time in her life, Emily felt genuine uncertainty. Her mother had never interrupted her before, had never shown any sign of understanding what Emily truly was. Catherine had always been easy to manipulate, eager to see the best in her daughter, willing to dismiss any evidence to the contrary. But as Catherine entered the room and quietly closed the door behind her, Emily realized that something had changed. Her mother's eyes went to the bag on the bed, to Emily's traveling clothes, and then back to her daughter's face. "I know what you've been planning," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I know about Robert Ashford. I know about the money you've stolen. I know about the documents you've forged." Emily's expression remained calm, but her mind was working frantically. How had her mother discovered any of this? She had been so careful, so meticulous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Emily said, her voice soft and confused, slipping into the role of the bewildered daughter. "Mother, I was just—" "Don't," Catherine interrupted, and there was steel in her voice that Emily had never heard before. "Don't lie to me anymore, Emily. I'm done being blind to what you are. Catherine moved to the small chair by the window and sat down, the candle casting shadows across her face. She looked older than her years, worn down by a weight she had carried in silence. I've known for a long time that something was wrong, Catherine continued. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was being unfair, that other mothers were jealous of your accomplishments and had poisoned my mind against you. But I knew. Deep down, I always knew. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle of letters. Emily recognized them immediately. They were the correspondence she had been conducting with Robert Ashford, letters she thought she had hidden carefully in a locked box in her wardrobe. I found these 3 weeks ago, Catherine said. I didn't want to believe what I was reading. I tried to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. But then I started paying attention, really paying attention to everything you did, and I saw the pattern. Emily remained silent, calculating her options. Her mother had found evidence of her current plan, but did she know about everything else? And more importantly, what did she intend to do with this information? I spoke with Miss Crawford, Catherine said, and Emily felt a jolt of genuine alarm. She's back in Boston, of course, but I wrote to her. I asked her about the circumstances of her dismissal. She sent me a very detailed letter explaining her suspicions about you. At first, I was angry at her for making such accusations against my daughter, but then I started investigating. Catherine's hand shook slightly as she continued. I went to the academy and spoke with Mrs. Pemberton. I convinced her to show me the complaints that had been filed about you over the years. I talked to some of the girls you had been friends with, the ones whose families would still speak to me. And I spoke with our own servants, really spoke with them, and convinced them to tell me the truth about things they had witnessed. The picture that emerged, Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly, was of a daughter I had refused to see. A girl who had been systematically cruel, manipulative, and calculated in ways I had convinced myself were impossible. Emily's mind was still racing, looking for an angle, a way to turn this situation to her advantage. But her mother's next words stopped her cold. I also hired an investigator, Catherine said, a discreet man from Baton Rouge who had no connection to our social circle. I asked him to look into the recent troubles involving the Beaumont family and Charles Devereux. She placed another set of papers on the small table beside her chair. He traced the anonymous letters that were sent to Devereux. The paper was a very specific type, expensive, made in France. Only 3 shops in New Orleans sell it. One of those shops has a record of selling 10 sheets to a young woman matching your description, who paid in cash and gave a false name. Emily's expression remained controlled, but internally she was reassessing everything. Her mother had been far more competent and determined than Emily had ever given her credit for. The investigator also discovered something else, Catherine continued. Robert Ashford's cousin in St. Louis. He doesn't exist. There is no cousin. The address you were given is for a boarding house, and the name you were given matches no one who has ever stayed there. This was new information, and it rocked Emily's confidence for the first time. She had verified Robert's story through his letters, through their conversations. How could... And then she understood. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. You, Emily said quietly, staring at her mother. You created the cousin. You intercepted the correspondence. Catherine nodded slowly. Once I understood what you were planning, I took steps to ensure that your plan would fail. I have been working with Robert Ashford for the past 2 weeks. He came to me after receiving a letter that I had forged, supposedly from his cousin, warning him that he was being used in a scheme he didn't fully understand. Robert is waiting for you right now, Catherine continued, but not where you expected. He's at the home of Judge Morrison, where he has spent the evening giving a full statement about your scheme. The judge has the forged bank documents you created. He has the accounting of the money you stole from this house. He has Robert's testimony about your plans to frame him for kidnapping. Emily felt the carefully constructed world she had built beginning to collapse. Her mother had outmaneuvered her, had thought several steps ahead, had done exactly what Emily herself would have done if their positions were reversed. "Why?" Emily asked, and for once there was genuine emotion in her voice. "Why would you do this to your own daughter?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because I failed you, Emily. From the time you were a small child, I saw signs that something was wrong, and I ignored them. I told myself you would grow out of it, that it was just a phase, that I was being paranoid. I failed to get you the help you needed, failed to protect the people you hurt, failed to protect you from yourself." She stood up, the candle casting her shadow large against the wall. "But I won't fail you anymore. Tomorrow morning, you will appear before Judge Morrison. The charges will include theft, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." "Murder?" Emily said, genuine surprise in her voice. "Robert would have been hanged for kidnapping a wealthy man's intended bride," Catherine said. "You knew that. You planned it. That makes you guilty of conspiracy to commit murder." The reality of her situation was sinking in. Emily had been so focused on executing her own plan that she had never considered the possibility that someone else might be executing a plan against her. "The judge has agreed to hear your case privately," Catherine continued. "Given your age and our family's position, he's willing to consider alternatives to a public trial. But make no mistake, Emily, there will be consequences for what you've done. Real consequences." Emily's mind was still working, still searching for an escape route. "You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial. Robert's testimony can be discredited. He's a clerk with no social standing. The letters could have been written by anyone. The paper purchase means nothing." "You're right," Catherine said. "Individually, each piece of evidence might be questioned, but together, they paint a clear picture. And there's one more thing you don't know." She pulled out a final item from her pocket, a small leather journal. Emily recognized it immediately. It was her private diary, the one she kept hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk. "I found your key," Catherine said simply. "I've read everything you wrote, every plan, every manipulation, every cruel thing you've done, and documented with such pride." Emily felt the last of her confidence draining away. The journal contained details of schemes going back years, written in her own hand, in her own words. It was a complete record of her actions, written by someone who had never imagined she would face consequences. "Why keep such a record?" Catherine asked, though it seemed she already knew the answer. "Because you were proud of what you'd done. Because you enjoyed looking back on your successes. Because you never truly believed you could be caught." The silence stretched between them. Emily could hear the sounds of the night outside her window, the distant call of a steamboat on the river, the rustle of leaves in the courtyard, the ticking of the clock in the hallway. "What happens now?" Emily finally asked. "Now," Catherine said, "you make a choice. You can come with me tomorrow morning to Judge Morrison's chambers and face the consequences of your actions. Or you can try to run tonight, and I will ensure that by tomorrow afternoon, every authority in New Orleans is looking for you, with your journal as evidence of what you are and what you've done." "That's not much of a choice," Emily said. "No," Catherine agreed. "It's not. But it's more than you gave any of your victims." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I want you to know something, Emily. Despite everything you are, despite everything you've done, you are still my daughter. I still love you, but I will not protect you anymore. I will not be complicit in your cruelty anymore. What happens now is up to the law and to God." Catherine left the room, closing the door behind her. Emily heard the click of a lock. Her mother had locked her in from the outside. She was trapped, with only the night remaining before she would have to face the consequences she had never truly believed would come. Emily sat on her bed, her mind still racing through scenarios, still looking for an escape. But for the first time in her life, she couldn't see a way out. Her mother had been thorough, had thought of everything, had closed off every avenue of escape. As dawn approached, Emily finally accepted that her manipulation, her cruelty, her carefully constructed schemes had all led to this moment. The perfect daughter, the model student, the brilliant young woman who could talk her way out of any situation. She had met an opponent who understood her completely because that opponent had spent 16 years watching her, loving her, and finally, reluctantly, seeing her for what she truly was. The macabre story of Emily Whitmore was about to become public knowledge, and the city of New Orleans would have to confront what it meant when evil wore a young, innocent face. The courthouse on Royal Street had never seen a case quite like the one that opened on a humid morning in late September. The proceedings were officially closed to the public, but word had spread through the city, and a crowd gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl who had become the subject of horrified whispers throughout New Orleans society. Judge Nathaniel Morrison was a man of considerable experience. He had presided over cases involving murder, fraud, piracy, and every form of human depravity that a port city could produce. But as he reviewed the evidence that Catherine Whitmore and her investigator had compiled, even he felt a chill of unease. The challenge facing the court was unprecedented. Emily Whitmore was 16 years old, below the age of full legal responsibility in most matters. Yet the evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that was both premeditated and sophisticated, demonstrating an understanding of human psychology and social manipulation that many adults never achieved. The law, Judge Morrison explained at the opening of the proceedings, was designed with certain assumptions about the nature of youth. We assume that young people act impulsively without full understanding of consequences, and that they are capable of reformation through proper guidance. This case challenges all of those assumptions. Present in the chamber were Emily, her parents, her attorney, Marcus Whitfield, one of the city's most respected lawyers, the prosecutor, District Attorney Thomas Callahan, and a court-appointed expert, Dr. Edmund Forsyth, who had studied moral philosophy and the development of conscience. The prosecution began by presenting the evidence systematically. Robert Ashford testified first, describing how Emily had courted him, manipulated his feelings, and drawn him into a scheme that would have resulted in his death. His testimony was straightforward and credible, made more powerful by his obvious shame at having been deceived. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Robert said, his voice heavy with bitterness. "Every conversation was calculated. Every word was chosen to make me feel special, to make me believe I was saving her from a terrible situation. And I was fool enough to believe it all." When asked why he had come forward to Catherine Whitmore instead of proceeding with the elopement, Robert explained that he had received the forged letter supposedly from his cousin. The letter had planted seeds of doubt, and when he investigated further, he discovered that the cousin he thought he had been corresponding with didn't exist. "That's when I realized," Robert said, "that nothing she had told me was true. The whole thing was a trap, and I was the bait." The prosecution then presented the physical evidence. The stolen money and valuables, carefully catalogued, the forged documents, examined by a handwriting expert who testified that they were consistent with samples of Emily's writing, the journal, read aloud in portions that detailed her various schemes and manipulations over the years. The courtroom sat in horrified silence as the prosecutor read Emily's own words, describing how she had manipulated Margaret Sullivan, how she had orchestrated the downfall of Miss Crawford, how she had provoked the conflict between Philip Beaumont and Charles Devereux. The clinical, almost cheerful tone of the journal entries was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. One entry, dated 6 months earlier, read, "M was crying again today about her father's warehouse fire. It's amusing how people assume disaster is random when it can be so easily arranged. A word to the right person, a suggestion planted at the right time, and circumstances align exactly as intended. Father says business success requires understanding human nature. I understand it better than he ever will. The defense attorney faced a nearly impossible task. His client had documented her own guilt in extraordinary detail. The evidence was overwhelming. But Marcus Whitfield was experienced and creative, and he understood that the only viable defense was to challenge the basic premise of the prosecution's case. Your Honor, Whitfield began in his opening statement, "We do not dispute that my client has engaged in behavior that is deeply troubling. What we dispute is the question of culpability. Emily Whitmore is 16 years old. The very fact that she kept such a detailed journal of her actions demonstrates a fundamental immaturity, a failure to understand that her actions might have consequences. An adult criminal knows to hide evidence. A child keeps a diary, never truly believing that their private thoughts might be exposed." It was a clever argument, using Emily's own arrogance and sense of invulnerability as evidence of her youth and limited understanding. Whitfield called Dr. Forsyth to the stand to discuss the development of moral reasoning in young people. Dr. Forsyth, a scholarly man in his 50s who had written extensively on moral education, testified about the theories of human development that were being discussed in academic circles. The capacity for moral reasoning, he explained, develops gradually through childhood and adolescence. Some young people, particularly those of high intelligence, may appear sophisticated in their thinking while still lacking the fundamental moral framework that guides adult behavior. Under questioning from the defense, Dr. Forsyth acknowledged that Emily's intelligence was exceptional and that highly intelligent children sometimes engaged in manipulative behavior as a form of intellectual exercise, without fully grasping the moral implications. But the prosecution was prepared for this line of defense. District Attorney Callahan rose for cross-examination with a copy of Emily's journal in hand. "Dr. Forsyth," Callahan asked, "you've testified about the development of moral reasoning in young people. Let me read you another passage from the defendant's journal, dated 4 months ago." He read, "The question isn't whether what I do is right or wrong by conventional standards. I understand those standards perfectly well. I simply don't feel bound by them. Most people are constrained by guilt, by empathy, by fear of consequences. I've discovered that I lack those constraints, and that makes me free to act according to my own interests without the emotional handicaps that limit others." Callahan looked up from the journal. "Doctor, does this sound like someone who lacks moral understanding, or someone who understands morality perfectly well and has simply chosen to reject it?" Dr. Forsyth was forced to acknowledge that the passage suggested a more sophisticated understanding than his theory of developmental delay would account for. "It does suggest," he admitted reluctantly, "a conscious choice rather than a developmental deficit." The testimony continued for days, with witness after witness describing their interactions with Emily. Margaret Sullivan, who had traveled from Virginia to testify, described in heartbreaking detail how Emily had systematically destroyed her family's happiness. Miss Crawford sent a lengthy affidavit from Boston, detailing her observations and the pattern of behavior she had witnessed. The servants from the Whitmore household testified, finally free to speak the truth about things they had observed but been afraid to mention. The dead birds in Emily's room, the scratches on the horse, the overheard conversations where Emily practiced different emotional affects in front of her mirror, teaching herself to cry on command and to simulate concern she didn't feel. One of the most devastating testimonies came from Marie Duchamp, the family's cook, who had known Emily since birth. Through tears, Marie described her growing realization over the years that the child she had helped raise lacked something fundamental. "I tried to teach her kindness," Marie said in her testimony, her Creole accent thick with emotion. "When she was small, I showed her how to be gentle with animals, how to help others, how to think of other people's feelings. but it was like teaching a blind person about colors. She could repeat the words, she could mimic the actions, but she never felt it. There was something missing inside her. Throughout all of this testimony, Emily sat quietly beside her attorney, her expression composed and neutral. She took notes occasionally, whispered to her lawyer, but showed no emotional reaction to the testimony being given against her. This unnatural calm became its own form of evidence, demonstrating to everyone present that Emily was exactly what the witnesses described. The most difficult moment came when Catherine Whitmore was called to testify. The prosecution handled her gently, understanding that she was both a victim and a witness. Catherine described the years of willful blindness, the growing realization of what her daughter was, and finally, the painful decision to act. "I want the court to understand," Catherine said, her voice trembling but clear, "that I love my daughter. I will always love her. But love without accountability isn't love at all. It's enabling. By protecting Emily from the consequences of her actions, I was allowing her to become more dangerous, to hurt more people. I had to choose between being a mother who protects her child from the world and being a mother who protects the world from her child." Jonathan Whitmore, Emily's father, was not called to testify. He sat in the courtroom throughout the proceedings, his face ashen, his entire worldview crumbling around him. The successful businessman who had prided himself on his judgment of character had failed to see what his own daughter truly was. The defense rested without calling Emily to testify, a strategic decision to avoid putting her on the stand, where the prosecution could question her directly. Instead, Whitfield focused his closing argument on the question of what should be done with a 16-year-old girl, however dangerous, in a legal system that had no framework for understanding her. "Your Honor," Whitfield argued, "we are faced with an unprecedented situation. The defendant is clearly troubled, clearly in need of intervention, but the penalties available under law, execution or imprisonment in conditions designed for hardened adult criminals, are not appropriate for someone of her age. I ask the court to consider that reformation, while difficult, may still be possible. To sentence her to death or to life in prison is to declare that a 16-year-old is beyond redemption. Is that truly a precedent we wish to establish?" It was a powerful argument, and it resonated with the fundamental discomfort everyone felt about treating a teenager as an adult criminal. But the prosecution had prepared for this as well. In his closing argument, District Attorney Callahan spoke directly to the question of precedent. "The defense is correct that this case is unprecedented, but that is because the defendant herself is unprecedented in the calculated nature of her cruelty. We must ask ourselves, if not now, when? If not for these actions, then for what actions would we hold a young person accountable?" He held up the journal again. "This document reveals someone who is not merely troubled or confused, but someone who has developed a philosophy of manipulation and cruelty. Someone who sees other people as objects to be used and discarded. Someone who takes pleasure in the suffering she causes and feels no remorse whatsoever. The question before this court," Callahan continued, "is not whether Emily Whitmore is young. She is. The question is whether her youth excuses what she has done and what she will inevitably do again if released without serious consequences. I submit that it does not." Judge Morrison took 3 days to consider his ruling. During that time, the city of New Orleans was consumed with debate about the case. Newspaper editorials argued both sides. Some insisted that a 16-year-old could not truly be held fully accountable for her actions, while others argued that Emily's sophistication and planning demonstrated a level of culpability that transcended her age. When the court reconvened for the ruling, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Morrison looked grave as he prepared to deliver his decision, the weight of precedent heavy on his shoulders. Judge Morrison began his ruling by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the case before him. "In my years on the bench," he said, I have presided over trials involving every manner of crime. I have seen violence born of passion, greed, desperation, and madness. But I have never before encountered anything quite like the pattern of behavior documented in this case. He reviewed the evidence systematically, acknowledging the strength of both the prosecution's case and the defense's arguments about youth and capacity. Then he addressed the central question that the case presented. The law traditionally treats young people differently from adults, Morrison said, based on the assumption that youth implies impulsivity, limited understanding of consequences, and the potential for reformation. But this case challenges us to consider whether those assumptions should apply universally, or whether there are rare cases where a young person demonstrates such calculated cruelty and such sophisticated planning that these assumptions no longer hold. He looked directly at Emily as he continued. Miss Whitmore, I have read your journal in its entirety. I have heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. I have reviewed the evidence of schemes that demonstrate planning and psychological manipulation that would be remarkable in a person of any age. And I find myself confronted with a difficult truth. You are not acting out of childish impulsivity or limited understanding. You are acting with full awareness of what you are doing and complete indifference to the suffering you cause. Morrison paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the courtroom. However, I am also conscious of the fact that you are 16 years old and that the law provides some protections for those of your age. I am conscious that sentencing you to death or to life imprisonment in adult facilities would set a precedent that could have far-reaching consequences for how we treat all juvenile offenders. Therefore, he said, I am going to impose a sentence that, while unprecedented, is designed to address the unique circumstances of this case. You are hereby convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder in the case of Robert Ashford. You are also found responsible for the damages inflicted on the families of Margaret Sullivan, Sarah Crawford, and others who have testified about your actions. I sentence you to 10 years of confinement in a specialized facility to be established specifically for cases such as yours, cases where young offenders demonstrate a pattern of sophisticated criminal behavior. This facility will be separate from adult prisons and will focus on constant observation, study, and attempted reformation. Morrison looked at Emily with an expression that mixed pity with steely resolve. You will not be free to harm anyone during this period. Every aspect of your life will be supervised and documented. You will receive instruction in moral philosophy, religion, and the practical consequences of cruelty. Whether this will change you, I cannot say. But society will be protected from you, and you will have an opportunity to demonstrate whether reformation is possible. Furthermore, Morrison continued, at the end of this 10-year period, you will be evaluated by a panel of medical and legal experts. If they determine that you still pose a danger to society, your confinement will continue until such time as they determine it is safe to release you. If you are released, you will remain under observation for the rest of your life, with strict conditions that can result in immediate re-imprisonment if violated. The sentence was controversial from the moment it was announced. Some argued it was too lenient, that Emily deserved execution or permanent imprisonment. Others argued it was too harsh, that 10 years was effectively a life sentence for someone so young. But Morrison's reasoning, that Emily required neither simple punishment nor simple mercy, but rather constant supervision and study, represented a genuinely novel approach to juvenile crime. The facility that Morrison ordered to be created was established on the outskirts of New Orleans, in a building that had previously served as a private academy. It was retrofitted with secure rooms, observation areas, and facilities for education and religious instruction. Emily was its first, and for several years, only occupant. The records of her time in the facility, preserved in state archives, make for disturbing reading. They document a young woman who never showed genuine remorse, who continued to manipulate staff members and fellow inmates when others were eventually added to the facility, and who maintained throughout that she had done nothing truly wrong. But the records also document something else, a gradual evolution in Emily's understanding of her own situation. Not moral reformation in the traditional sense, but a kind of cold calculation that she could no longer operate in society the way she once had. She learned to mimic remorse more convincingly than before. She learned which behaviors would be rewarded and which would extend her confinement. Dr. Forsyth, the moral philosopher who had testified at her trial, visited Emily regularly during her confinement. His notes from these sessions reveal a mind of extraordinary intelligence grappling with its own nature. In one recorded conversation from Emily's 20th year, she told Dr. Forsyth, "I understand now what you all wanted from me. You wanted me to feel guilt, to feel empathy, to genuinely regret what I'd done. But I can't manufacture those feelings any more than you can manufacture the ability to see infrared light. What I can do is understand intellectually why society requires those feelings, and I can behave in ways that suggest I have them, even though I don't." Dr. Forsyth's response was telling. "And you think that's enough?" "I think it has to be," Emily replied, "because it's all I have to offer." The question of whether Emily Whitmore was reformed or merely became better at hiding what she was would never be fully answered. After 10 years, the evaluation panel was deeply divided. Some members believed she had demonstrated sufficient change to warrant release under strict conditions. Others believed she was exactly the same as she had always been, simply more careful about revealing it. In the end, Emily was released at age 26, under conditions that essentially amounted to permanent parole. She was required to report regularly to authorities, forbidden from working in positions where she would have power over others, and subject to immediate re-imprisonment if she was suspected of manipulative or harmful behavior. Emily left New Orleans immediately upon release, settling eventually in a small town in Pennsylvania under a different name. She lived a quiet life, working as a bookkeeper, never marrying, maintaining minimal social connections. Whether this represented genuine reformation or simply strategic withdrawal from a society that would always watch her suspiciously, no one could say for certain. She died in circumstances that were themselves mysterious, at age 38, found in her modest apartment with no apparent cause of death beyond what the local doctor described as heart failure. But those who remembered the case of Emily Whitmore couldn't help but wonder if she had found one final way to control her own narrative, choosing the time and manner of her exit from the world. The legacy of the case extended far beyond Emily herself. Judge Morrison's decision to create a specialized facility for young offenders who demonstrated sophisticated criminal behavior became a model that other jurisdictions studied. The case was discussed in legal journals and medical texts, becoming a reference point for debates about juvenile crime, moral development, and the limits of reformation. Catherine Whitmore survived her daughter by 2 decades, devoting her remaining years to charitable work focused on children who showed signs of behavioral problems. She never stopped loving Emily, but she also never wavered in her conviction that protecting her daughter from consequences would have been the greater cruelty. Jonathan Whitmore never fully recovered from the revelation of what his daughter was. His business declined, his social standing diminished, and he died less than 5 years after the trial, a broken man who had lost faith in his own judgment. The Beaumont family left New Orleans and never returned. James Beaumont never married, carrying the scars of his near miss with Emily for the rest of his life. In his later years, he would tell people that the experience had taught him that evil could wear any face, and that the most dangerous people were often those who seemed most trustworthy. Robert Ashford, who had nearly been sacrificed to Emily's scheme, used his experience to become an advocate for workers' rights and legal protections for those without wealth or social standing. He argued that Emily had been able to manipulate him so easily because the social structure of their time made men like him desperate for any opportunity to improve their circumstances, a desperation that made them vulnerable to exploitation. The case of Emily Whitmore became part of New Orleans folklore, one of those cautionary tales that parents would reference when teaching children about deception and the importance of looking beneath surface appearances. But the true significance of the case was deeper than simple moral lessons. Emily Whitmore forced American society in the mid-19th century to confront uncomfortable truths about youth, crime, and moral capacity. She challenged the assumption that children were inherently innocent and that proper upbringing would inevitably produce virtuous adults. She demonstrated that intelligence and cruelty could coexist in a young mind, and that sophisticated evil was not the exclusive province of hardened adult criminals. The question that haunted everyone who encountered Emily's story was whether she was born the way she was or made that way by circumstances. Dr. Forsyth spent years studying this question, interviewing Emily extensively, and trying to understand the origins of her particular pathology. His conclusion, published in a medical journal years later, was characteristically nuanced. We may never fully understand what creates a mind like Emily Whitmore's. Perhaps it is an innate deficiency, a missing piece in the architecture of the soul that prevents the normal development of conscience and empathy. Perhaps it is the result of subtle damages in early childhood, traumas or failures of attachment that we lack the tools to detect. Most likely, it is some interaction between innate temperament and environmental factors, a tragic alignment of circumstances that produces something genuinely dangerous. What we can say with certainty, Dr. Forsyth wrote, is that Emily Whitmore was not a monster in the sense that popular imagination understands the term. She was a human being, undeniably human in her intelligence and her capacity for planning and self-awareness. What made her dangerous was not supernatural evil, but rather a very human ability to manipulate other humans, combined with a complete absence of the normal constraints of guilt and empathy that make social life possible. The case of Emily Whitmore, he concluded, should serve as a reminder that the greatest dangers we face often come not from obvious monsters, but from those who can navigate our social world with perfect competence while remaining fundamentally disconnected from the emotional bonds that make us truly human. The courthouse where Emily was tried still stands in New Orleans, now a historical building that hosts tours. Guides tell the story of the girl who was called America's cruelest teenager, though the details are often simplified and sensationalized for modern audiences. The actual historical records are preserved in the state archives, available to researchers who want to understand what really happened. Those who take the time to read through the original documents, the trial transcripts, the journal entries, the letters and testimonies, are invariably disturbed by what they find. Not because the story contains graphic violence or supernatural elements, but because it reveals something uncomfortably real about human nature. Emily Whitmore was not a creature from nightmare. She was a 16-year-old girl with remarkable intelligence, careful planning abilities, and an absolute void where empathy and conscience should have been. She could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's neighbor, anyone's friend. And that, more than any specific crime she committed, is what makes her story genuinely macabre. In a society that wanted to believe that youth equaled innocence, that proper upbringing guaranteed virtue, and that evil was always obviously recognizable, Emily Whitmore presented an inconvenient truth: that cruelty could emerge from unexpected places, that manipulation could be practiced with cold skill by someone barely past childhood, and that the human capacity for causing harm was not limited by age or social position. The ultimate question raised by her case remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Can someone who lacks the fundamental capacity for empathy ever truly be reformed? Or is the best we can hope for a kind of learned behavior, where harmful actions are restrained not by genuine moral feeling, but by calculated self-interest in avoiding punishment. Emily's own words, recorded in a final interview before her release from confinement, provide a disturbing perspective on this question. When asked if she felt she had changed during her 10 years of confinement, she replied with characteristic precision, "I have learned a great deal. I understand much better now how society functions and what it requires from its members. I understand that my earlier behavior was unsustainable because it inevitably led to consequences I couldn't escape. I have learned to be more careful, more patient, more attuned to the need to maintain appearances. Whether that constitutes the kind of change you're hoping for, I leave for you to decide." It was an answer that satisfied no one and troubled everyone. Because what Emily was describing was not moral reformation, but rather strategic adaptation. Becoming better at hiding what she was rather than changing what she was. And yet, the records of her life after release suggest that this strategic adaptation, however unsatisfying philosophically, may have been effective practically. Emily lived quietly, harmed no one that anyone could detect, and faded into obscurity. Whether she achieved this through genuine change or through superior manipulation was a question that would never be definitively answered. The macabre story of Emily Whitmore remains a haunting chapter in American legal history, a case that challenged assumptions, defied easy answers, and left a legacy of questions about the nature of evil, the capacity for change, and the limits of justice when confronting a mind that operates outside the normal boundaries of human emotion and morality. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Emily's story is how ordinary it began. A bright child in a respectable family, showing early signs that something was wrong, signs that were ignored or explained away until the pattern of harm became undeniable. It serves as a reminder that the greatest tragedies often begin with small warnings that go unheeded, and that the courage to see the truth, even when it involves someone we love, can be the most important intervention of all. Catherine Whitmore's decision to stop protecting her daughter and instead protect her daughter's potential victims was an act of profound moral courage. It cost her everything: her relationship with her daughter, her social standing, her peace of mind. But it was the right choice, the only choice that honored both her love for Emily and her responsibility to the wider community. In that sense, the story of Emily Whitmore is not just about a cruel teenager, but about the adults around her who eventually found the strength to do what was necessary, however painful. It's about the price of loving someone who cannot love in return, and the greater price of enabling that person to continue causing harm. The courthouse bells ring in New Orleans, marking the hours as they have for nearly 2 centuries. The city has changed beyond recognition since the days when Emily Whitmore walked its streets, but human nature remains constant. The capacity for cruelty, for manipulation, for cold calculation in service of selfish ends. These are not artifacts of a bygone era, but enduring aspects of what humans can become when the normal constraints of conscience fail to develop. Emily Whitmore's story stands as a warning, a mystery, and ultimately, a tragedy. A warning about the dangers of willful blindness and the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths. A mystery about the origins and nature of human cruelty. And a tragedy not just for Emily herself, but for everyone whose life she touched and damaged in her cold, calculated progress through the world. The final word should perhaps belong to Judge Morrison, who wrote in his private journal after sentencing Emily, "I have today made a decision that will define my career and possibly change how we think about juvenile crime for generations to come. I do not know if I have done justice. I do not know if what I have ordered will make any difference at all. What I do know is that I have encountered something in that young woman's eyes that I hope never to see again. The complete absence of what makes us human. God help us all if Emily Whitmore is not as unique as I pray she is." History suggests that Judge Morrison's prayer may have been answered. Or perhaps Emily's case simply represents the rare instance where such a person's actions were documented and preserved. Either way, her story remains a sobering reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs, that youth does not guarantee innocence, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand perfectly how to blend in, how to manipulate trust, and how to hide in plain sight until the moment they choose to strike. The macabre story of Emily Whitmore ends not with resolution, but with enduring questions about justice, reformation, and the nature of human morality itself. Questions that remain as relevant today as they were in the humid courthouse chambers of New Orleans in the autumn of 1843. Now, I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but create them. It takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos, since I am grateful.